Wyoming Territory, 1879. The wind came hard off the snowy range that morning, whipping dust across the town of Laramie as the westbound train groaned into the station. Persephone Oakes stepped off with a carpetbag in one hand and a rifle slung over her shoulder. Her boots hit the platform like she meant to stay. The black crepe ribbon still pinned to her collar said she was mourning, but her eyes were clear and sharp, the kind that had seen too much to pretend otherwise. She had 2 children with her, a boy and a girl, both quiet, both clutching her skirts like they were afraid the ground might shift beneath them. A man stepped aside to let her pass and tipped his hat. "Ma'am." She nodded but said nothing. She did not trust Easy. Not since her husband rode off 2 years ago and never came back. Not since the war took her brother and cholera took her parents. Not since she buried her youngest baby in a cracked pine box outside of Abilene last spring. She was done believing in people. The children, Beatrice, age 7, and Benjamin, just turned 5, didn't ask where they were going anymore. They simply followed her. It was what they had learned to do. The truth was, Persephone did not know what came next. Her cousin had promised a place to stay outside Laramie, but when she reached the ranch, the house stood empty. A neighbor said the cousin had packed up and gone to Oregon 6 months ago. She stood there in the yard, the wind tugging at her skirts. The children huddled behind her and stared at the sagging porch. "All right," she whispered, mostly to herself. "We just keep going." That was when a rider came up the hill. He was tall in the saddle, hat low, coat dusty. The horse he rode was a strong chestnut and moved like it understood the land. The man dismounted slow and easy, like he had time to spare, and tied the reins to the fence post. "You lost?" he asked. She straightened. "No." He looked at the boarded windows, then back at her. "Funny. Looks like you might be." She did not move. "My cousin lived here. Name, Lula Oakes. She said she had a room for me and my children." The man nodded. "Lula married a wheat farmer and headed west. This place has been empty half a year." Persephone's mouth went tight. "Then we will find somewhere else." The children clung tighter. The boy shivered. The man looked at her again. "Name's Kellan Easton. I work cattle over the ridge. My mother used to bring food to Lula when her youngest was sick. She never mentioned cousins." Persephone did not answer. He looked at the children. "They yours?" "Yes." "Where's their father gone?" That one word said more than a dozen could have. Kellan didn't press. Instead, he crouched to the children's height. "You too hungry?" They looked up at their mother. She gave a small nod. Kellan stood. "I ain't going to hurt you. I got stew at the bunkhouse and a warm fire. You can ride with me or stay here and freeze tonight. Up to you." Persephone looked at the sky. The sun was already falling behind the trees. Another cold night in an empty house with no stove, no food, no locks on the doors. She met his eyes. "We will ride with you." He helped the children onto the horse first, then handed her up. When she hesitated, he offered his hand. "I do not trust Easy," she said. "I will wait until you do," he replied, steady as stone. She took his hand. The bunkhouse was clean, warm, and smelled of beef and cornbread. There were 5 men there, all polite, none pushy. They gave her space, offered food, and made sure the children had blankets by the fire. Kellan brought her a stool and a plate. "You do not have to talk," he said. "You can just eat." She did. And when the children fell asleep curled up near the hearth, he covered them with his own coat. That night she sat across from him at the small kitchen table, the lamp between them. He sipped coffee. She watched the flames. "You planning to keep moving?" he asked. "I do not know. I could use help," he said. "My housekeeper left to care for her sick sister down in Colorado. There is laundry, cooking, someone to watch the stock when I am out riding. I can pay. You and the children would have your own room." She narrowed her eyes. "Why would you offer that to a woman you just met?" "Because I remember what it is to lose everything," he said. "And because I got no use for a heart that only helps when it is easy." She studied him a long time, then nodded once. "We will stay. But only for now." "Fair enough." 2 weeks passed. She scrubbed floors, cooked meals, patched shirts, and laid out salt blocks for the cattle. The children grew stronger, less quiet. Beatrice started reading again. Benjamin chased barn cats and laughed when they scattered. She started sleeping through the night. Kellan was patient. He never asked questions she did not want to answer. He never hovered. But every evening he brought in firewood so she would not have to. Every time the children needed something, he found it. A carved whistle for Benjamin. A ribbon for Beatrice's hair. A book for Persephone left quietly on her pillow. She caught him watching her once from the porch. Not like a man measuring a woman, but like a man noticing the way she moved through the world. Careful, capable, tired but not broken. She walked past him without speaking, but her hand brushed his sleeve as she passed. That night she found fresh apples on the windowsill and a note in plain handwriting. "For the pie you mentioned." She baked it the next day. He asked for seconds. She gave him the last piece. One morning a rider came hard up the trail. Persephone was in the barn with the children when she heard the shouts. "Easton, you got trouble. That outlaw crew from the south, they came through Elk Horn, took 2 farms, burned a third." Kellan's jaw tightened. "How close?" 3 miles. He saddled his horse. "I will ride out, you stay here." "I am going with you," Persephone said. He looked at her. "You have children." "I can shoot." He nodded once. "Fair enough." She handed Beatrice a knife. "Lock the door. Do not open it unless it is me or Kellan." Beatrice's face was pale, but she nodded. They rode hard. It was not a long fight. Kellan took down one man. Persephone shot the other when he tried to flank him. Her hands shook, but she stood her ground. When it was done, she sat on a rock and did not speak. Kellan knelt beside her. Blood stained the hem of her skirt. "You did what you had to do," he said. She nodded. "I know." He touched her hand. "Are you all right?" She looked at him. "I think I am." That night by the fire she sat beside him. The children slept. The wind howled outside. "I still do not know how to trust," she said. He turned to her. "Then I will stay until you do." She looked at him for a long time. Then she reached for his hand and held it in hers. And this time, she did not let go. The thaw came late that spring. Snow held to the shaded folds of the hills like it meant to stay, but the creek behind the barn ran fuller each morning, and wild geese cut long lines across the sky. Persephone hung linens on the line behind the bunkhouse, her hands raw from lye soap and wind. Beatrice helped her fold, while Benjamin crouched in the frost-thinned grass, tracing the hoof prints left by Kellan's horse. Inside the main house, Kellan patched the roof where a branch had come down during the last storm. From the ladder, he could see the ridge beyond the pasture, streaked with meltwater and new grass. He watched Persephone walk the children back toward the porch, her stride still guarded but no longer brittle. The boy tugged at her hand, and she let him. That evening, she came to the kitchen carrying a bundle of mended shirts. She laid them on the table beside the ledger book. "You were short 3 buttons," she said. "I used some from the coat in the trunk." Kellan nodded. "I'll order more when I go into town." She hesitated, then asked, "You ride in often?" "Only when I have to. I trade with the Wilkins place mostly. Dry goods, feed, sometimes coffee." She brushed her hand along the edge of the table. "I'd like to come next time. Beatrice needs boots. She's outgrown the pair from Lula's house." "All right, I'll hitch the wagon." She looked up. "I said I'd like to come. I didn't ask if I could." "I know," he said. Wasn't treating it like permission. The silence that followed wasn't sharp. It just sat between them like a shared understanding. She picked up the shirts and turned to go. He called after her, "You sew better than my mother ever did." She paused. "She teach you to ride?" "No," he said. "My father did that. My mother taught me to keep quiet when someone's trying." The corner of her mouth lifted, almost. They left for town 2 days later before dawn. Beatrice sat between them in the wagon, her new ribbon tied at the end of a long braid. Benjamin rode in the back with a sack of eggs nestled in straw. The road was slow and muddy in places, but the sun broke through by mid-morning, and the children pointed out prairie dogs and red-winged blackbirds as they passed. They reached Laramie by noon. Persephone kept close to the children while Kellan spoke with the man at the feed store. She didn't cling or falter, but she kept one hand on Benjamin's shoulder at all times. They moved through town steady as a current bootmaker, dry goods. The wagon loaded slow with flour, salt, oilcloth. When they stopped at the seamstresses for fabric, Kellan waited outside with the children. He watched her through the window as she chose muslin and twill, her movements careful, like she was measuring more than cloth. Later, when the wagon was full and the sun had begun its long fall westward, they stopped at the edge of a small cemetery. Persephone didn't speak, just climbed down and walked to a low iron gate. The children stayed in the wagon. Kellan followed her only partway, then waited. She knelt beside a stone so worn the name was barely legible. She stayed for a long while, head bowed, hands resting on her skirts. When she rose, her shoulders were straighter. "Back on the road," she said. "I had another daughter. We buried her here last spring." Kellan didn't speak right away. Then quiet, "You named her, Lydia." He looked out at the hills. "That's a name that carries." "It does." That night, after the children had gone to bed, she stepped out onto the porch where he was mending a lantern. The wind had quieted for once, and the stars had come out clear. "I'm not used to anyone waiting on me," she said. "I'm not in any hurry," he answered. She moved closer, arms folded. "Most men would have expected something by now." "I'm not most men," she studied him. "I don't know what to do with that." "You don't have to do anything at all." She was silent, then said, "I still wake up some nights thinking I'm back in Abilene, that he's coming home, that I'll hear his boots on the step." Kellan didn't look away. "I won't try to take something that still belongs to someone else." She shook her head. "It doesn't, not anymore, but it left holes I don't know how to fill." He set down the lantern. "Then I'll sit here a while. Just so you don't have to look at them alone." Her hand found the porch rail, gripping it hard. Then, slowly, she let go and sat beside him. They didn't speak again that night, but when she rose to go inside, she touched his shoulder, and he covered her hand with his. Just once. And when the door closed behind her, he stayed where he was, watching the sky, the stars, and the house she had begun to make her own. The first calf was born under a soft rain just before dusk. Kellan found it half buried in the mud, legs trembling, nose slick with birth. He knelt in the darkening light, brushing wet straw from its coat, and when he heard the barn door creak behind him, he didn't need to look up to know she was there. "He's early," she said, stepping closer. "He's small," Kellan replied, "but he's breathing." Persephone crouched beside him and reached out, careful and steady, placing one palm along the calf's flank. "Cold," she murmured. "We need to dry him off." Kellan handed her a feed sack, and they worked in silence, shoulder to shoulder, until the calf began to blink and nudge toward the cow's belly. When they stood, she brushed hay from her skirt and looked at him, not with gratitude but with something quieter. Trust, not yet whole but forming. The rain held through the night. In the morning, the children woke to the sound of it tapping against the windows, and Persephone found Kellan already in the kitchen, boiling water and laying out the tin cups. "You sleep at all?" she asked, tying her hair back. "Couple hours. The fence near the North Creek's washed out." He passed her a biscuit. I'm heading up when the light comes. She glanced out the window. You'll need someone to hold the post while you mend. His brow lifted. You offering? I can hammer a spike better than most ranch hands. He didn't argue. At the barn, she handed Beatrice a wrapped loaf and gave her a list of things to watch for chickens getting into the feed, the pot boiling too high. Beatrice nodded solemnly. I'll take care of him, she said, nodding toward her brother, who was tugging at the sleeves of a coat too big for him. I know you will, Persephone answered. Then she kissed her forehead without thinking, and something in Beatrice's shoulders eased up near the creek. The wind was sharper. They worked in rhythm, boots sunk in mud, sleeves soaked, hands red with cold. Kellan drove the rails into place while Persephone steadied them, bracing herself with the strength of someone who'd had no choice but to be strong. After the last post was set, they sat on a flat stone beneath a cottonwood stripped bare by winter. Kellan pulled a flask from his coat and offered it to her. She took a sip, winced. Tastes like turpentine. Cheaper than it used to be. She handed it back. How long have you been out here? Since I was 16. My father died on a drive south of Cheyenne. I stayed. She looked at him. You ever think about leaving? He capped the flask. Not anymore. This land taught me how to be still. She watched the creek for a while. I used to think I'd end up in Kansas City. My mother had sisters there. Talked about it like it was a place where the sky never got ugly. Why didn't you go? Because the train ticket cost more than our horse, and when you're raising 3 children under 6, you don't dream about cities. You just try to keep them fed. He didn't ask about the 3rd child. He didn't need to. They rode back under a clearing sky. Mud clung to their boots and Kellan's hands were scraped raw. At the house, the windows glowed with firelight and Benjamin was asleep under a quilt on the settee. Beatrice curled beside him with a book on her lap. Persephone pulled off her coat and hung it near the stove. You were right, she said. The fence needed fixing. I usually am, Kellan replied. She turned toward him. You ever stop waiting? For what? For someone to trust you. He studied her face, then stepped forward and reached out, slow as dusk. His hand found hers chapped, cold but open. I wasn't waiting for just anyone. She didn't pull away. You still aren't. He let out a breath that felt like it had been held for years. Good. Later, after the children were tucked in and the lamps turned low, she stood in the doorway of the kitchen and watched as he put the last log on the fire. He turned to find her there, arms loose at her sides, not guarded anymore but steady. You're not a man who pushes, she said. No, she took a step closer. But you stay. I do. She reached for the collar of his shirt, fingers brushing the edge of a stitch she'd sewn herself. Then stay with me. He didn't speak. He just reached for her hand, drew it to his chest, and held it there above the scar from a broken rib, above the place where all his quiet had waited. And when they kissed, it wasn't hurried or hungry. It was the kind of kiss people give after storms, after long seasons of silence. The kind of kiss that says, I see what you've carried and I'm not afraid of it. She didn't need to say she trusted him. He already knew. By June, the grass reached to the children's knees and the creek ran clear and quick beneath the cottonwoods. The last frost was weeks behind them, and the land had softened its edges. Persephone stood barefoot in the garden behind the house, loosening soil around the carrot rows with her fingers. Beatrice sat nearby stringing beads onto horsehair, her face shaded by a brimmed hat Kellan had cut down to fit her. Benjamin crouched in the weeds beside the fence, whispering to a turtle he'd found in the shallows. The house no longer felt like someone else's. The walls bore the weight of their days now. Kellan returned that afternoon with a wagon load of cedar planks and a coil of rope. He led the horse around back, where Persephone wiped her hands clean on her apron and met him beside the porch. You building something? She asked, eyeing the load. Thinking of a chicken coop, he said. The old one leans like it's got a grudge. She folded her arms. You planning to build it alone? I was hoping you might have an opinion or two. I've got more than that. He set down the rope. Good. I'd rather build something right the first time. They started before supper, laying the base along the slope behind the barn. She measured while he sawed, and when the children came to watch, he handed Beatrice a square and showed Benjamin how to hold a nail steady without bruising his thumb. Persephone watched from the corner of her eye, her mouth still, her gaze lingering longer than it once had. Later, after the coop had begun to take shape and the children had wandered off in search of fireflies, she crouched beside the frame and ran her hand along one of the planks. My father used to say you could tell if a thing would last by the way it sat on the earth, she said. Kellan knelt beside her. What do you think? I think this won't fall apart when the wind turns mean, he nodded. That's the hope. She looked at him then, something steady in her expression. You talk less than most men I've known. I figure a man ought to leave room for silence. She brushed sawdust from her skirt. I used to think silence meant someone had nothing to say. Now I think maybe it just means they're listening. I reckon that's true. She stood and offered her hand not as a gesture, but as a simple fact. This is where I am, and I'll let you meet me here. He took it, calloused palm to calloused palm, and followed her into the fading light. That night, after the children had fallen asleep with dirt still under their fingernails and the windows left open to the warm air, Persephone sat at the table sewing a patch onto Kellan's workshirt. He leaned against the counter, watching the way her fingers moved. You ever miss your old life? He asked. She didn't look up. It wasn't much of a life, just a stretch of days strung together with worry. You seem more settled here. I'm not sure I know what settled feels like. He shifted his weight. Maybe it feels like knowing you'll wake up and the roof won't leak, your hands won't be empty, and the man across the table wants to stay. She paused, needle halfway through cloth. You always speak plain like that, only when I mean it. She looked at him then, long and quiet. I'm not afraid of starting over, she said, but I want to start with someone who won't leave when it gets hard. I won't leave. She set the shirt aside. Then I think I'm ready to stay. He crossed the room without hurry. When he reached her, he didn't ask, didn't lean, didn't press. He simply opened his arms, and she stepped into them. They held each other in the hush of a house that had once stood empty. And it wasn't the fire or the warmth of June that made it feel like home. It was the way they fit two people who had once been scattered and had chosen, piece by piece, to come together. Outside, the wind shifted in the trees. Inside, neither of them moved. By late July, the fields had turned a deep green, and the air held the dry warmth of a land finally fed. The coop behind the barn stood square and solid, already home to a half-dozen hens that Beatrice named with grave importance. Benjamin had taken to guarding them with a wooden stick he called his Marshall cane, and no fox dared come near. Persephone rose before the sun most days now, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She liked the hush before the house woke, the creak of the floorboards under her bare feet, the low breath of the fire coming back to life. The quiet was different now, no longer the kind that came from loss, but the kind that let her listen inward. That morning, she found Kellan mending the gate latch with a rusted wrench and a length of new chain. His hat was pushed back, and his shirt was damp at the collar. You've been out here since before breakfast. It's been sticking open. I thought I'd fix it before the cattle start wandering again. She leaned against the post and squinted up at the sky. You always fix things before they break. Try to. She watched his hands a moment. You ever think about building something more permanent? A house, not just the bunkhouse meant for passing hands. He looked up. I have. What stopped you? Didn't have a reason to finish it. She stepped closer, brushing her thumb along a splintered edge. You do now. He held her gaze. That sounds like something you want. I want a roof that belongs to all of us. One with a porch wide enough for sleeping out on hot nights, and a kitchen where both children can sit at the table without knocking knees. He nodded once, like he'd already started drawing the lines in his head. Then we'll build it, she smiled, small and firm. Not someday, soon. He wrapped the chain around the post and tightened the bolt. I'll mark the land this evening. That night after supper, they walked the rise behind the barn, the children trailing behind chasing fireflies. Kellan stopped beneath a cottonwood where the ground held firm. Here. Persephone turned in a slow circle, taking in the view. The barn to the west, pasture beyond, the creek curving down like a ribbon below. Yes, she said. This is the right place. Beatrice plucked a feather from the grass and tucked it behind her ear. Can I have a corner with a window? You'll have two, Kellan said. Benjamin pointed to the east. I want to see the sun when I wake up. You will, Persephone promised. Over the next weeks, the work began in earnest. Kellan cut the beams himself, hauling them from the sawmill 2 counties over. Persephone kept plans drawn on scrap paper, measuring twice, checking the ledger for every nail and pane of glass. The children helped where they could, gathering stones for the foundation, handing up tools, sweeping sawdust from the floorboards once they were laid. The house rose slow and sure, each board set with the care of people who meant to stay. Persephone planted lavender beneath the windows. Kellan carved the door frame himself, notched with the year and a simple mark at the top 2 branches crossing, hers and his. By the time the roof was shingled and the stovepipe rose straight into the sky, it was late September. The mornings came crisp, and the maples near the creek had begun to bronze. One evening, Persephone stepped into the new kitchen, now swept clean and smelling of pine. She ran her hand along the table Kellan had built from oak timbers, smooth as river stone. He stood in the doorway behind her. They're asleep, he said, both of them, worn out from chasing each other through the rafters. She turned. They're happy. They are, so am I. He crossed the floor, slow and certain. I asked Beatrice what she thought of the house. She said it feels like it was always supposed to be here. She's right. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a ring, plain silver, the kind that wouldn't catch on thread or rope. I don't have speeches, he said. Just this, if you want it. Her eyes didn't fill with tears. They held steady. You already have my yes. You had it the day you stayed when I didn't ask you to. He took her hand and slid the ring on, his fingers warm against hers. She leaned into him, her forehead resting just beneath his chin. We'll grow old here, she said. We'll grow old together, he answered. They married beneath the cottonwood where they'd first marked the land. The preacher came out from Laramie in a borrowed wagon. The children wore their best clothes, and the men from the bunkhouse stood in a line, hats in hand, grinning like they'd known all along. There was no music, but Beatrice sang a few lines of a hymn her grandmother used to hum, and Benjamin handed over the rings with solemn pride. Afterward, they ate cornbread and blackberry preserves on the porch, and Kellan carried Persephone across the threshold of the house they'd built with their own hands. That night, when the children were asleep in their new rooms and the fire crackled low, Persephone curled against Kellan in the bed frame he'd hewn from maple. She whispered, I didn't think I'd ever feel safe again. He kissed her temple. You don't have to think anymore. Just feel it. Outside, the wind moved through the grass, steady and soft. And inside, where the light was warm and the walls held fast, they lay wrapped in peace, in the kind of love that grows not from words or promises, but from all the quiet days that came before and all the ones still waiting. They never left that land. The house held through every season. Beatrice learned to read by lamplight at the kitchen table. Benjamin raised a calf of his own and named it after the creek. Persephone planted an orchard one spring, and by the time the first apple ripened, she and Kellan had built a life so solid, nothing could shake it. And no matter how many years passed, when the wind turned cold and the nights grew long, they still sat on the porch hand in hand, watching the sky, knowing they'd found what they were never certain they would: a home, a family, and each other. Forever.